The next speaker I'd like to turn to is Zach Spicer. Zach is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy and Administration at York University. He has a ton of municipal experience. I've had one conversation with Zach, and I was blown away by the knowledge that he has in this field. I'd say he lives and breathes this stuff, and he's a great resource. If you heard Mike Farwell's show today, you would have heard Zach speaking about amalgamation. And so, Zach, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and you tell us the subject that you're going to talk about and what you're going to inform us about. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks so much, and thanks Rob for having me here tonight. I really appreciate it. So I think I'm the only one of the speakers tonight who's not a resident of the region of Waterloo. I have been in the past, so 2 points in my life. I was a Waterloo resident. I was an MA student at Laurier, and I did my postdoctoral work back at Laurier as well. So I should mention too, my wife's family is also from Wellesley, so I'm back every year for the Apple Butter and Cheese Festival. So all to say, I've heard about amalgamation within Waterloo for a number of years. I feel like it's a conversation that I've had a couple of times. So I'm more than happy to have it again tonight. It's definitely a fascinating one for someone like me. So I thought it would be helpful to start the conversation from my perspective by contrasting where I used to live in Waterloo, which is of course a two-tier regional system, with where I live right now and where I'm speaking to you from tonight, which is Hamilton, which is a former two-tier regional government that was one of the ones that was forced to be amalgamated in 2001 and is now a large single-tier city. So I think that the contrast in both may help to illustrate what I think are some of the strengths and weaknesses of both systems. So just a little bit of history, not as much as Ken had, but just a tiny little bit. In January 2001, the old city of Hamilton was merged with the 5 surrounding towns of Flamborough, Glanbrook, Stony Creek, Ancaster, and Dundas. So when everyone thinks of Hamilton, you probably think of the Steel City and factories, things along those lines. But the reality is, because of amalgamation, most of Hamilton is actually rural. So agribusiness contributes close to $1 billion to our local economy. We have close to 1,000 working farms within the city. So not necessarily the image of the old Steel City, and not one that you get when you cross the Burlington Skyway and you see all the factories along the waterfront that are popping smoke in the sky and stuff like that. So amalgamation made us quite large, right? So we're about 1,200 square kilometers, so we're very large. In fact, we stretch all the way from the Niagara region, the Halton region, to Waterloo, Brant County, Wellington County. All to say, geographically, we are very, very big. And big can bring governance challenges, especially given that we have such large and, to be frank, quite vocal urban, rural, and suburban communities. This has made it difficult to aggregate political interests and has bred somewhat of a simmering resentment in certain portions of the city that still hasn't really subsided in the past 20 years. You don't need to go far in Hamilton to find someone who may live downtown who will complain loudly and confidently that the city is run by the suburbs and serves purely suburban interests. Likewise, you could very easily find someone who lives in the suburbs who say the exact opposite and argue with the exact same confidence that amalgamation has done nothing but concentrate power in the hands of urban politicians to the disadvantage of urban ratepayers. The reality is that really neither of them is right, but neither of them is wrong either, right? So at best, you could say that Hamilton is really a community of communities, but we lack the institutional structure to recognize the distinction and support the needs of each of those communities. In a way, then, we're also kind of too big and too small. We're too big to appropriately respond to local needs in some areas, but we're also still too small to really control regional issues or to have a meaningful impact on provincial policy. So we're simply not the large actor that many envisioned at the time of amalgamation. Regional government, for the most part, offers a unique opportunity to capture economies of scale by delivering services at different levels of government to optimize efficiency. So, for instance, the upper tier could deliver region-wide services like arterial roads, policing, whatever it might be, while the lower tier could deliver services that are entirely local in nature. So services can be moved between tiers to find the most efficient delivery formula. This also ensures that different service levels can be had throughout the region. So for instance, rural areas may not want to pay for things like trash pickup or transit. Regional government allows for some degree of variation of service levels that single tier amalgamated communities simply can't. So for instance, one of our largest debates here in Hamilton right now has to do with area rating, where those in the rural areas pay a different amount of property tax based upon different levels of services that are available to them. Our newly elected council has indicated that that will change, much to the alarm of a lot of those who are within the rural areas of the city. So in general, research has showed us that consolidation hasn't had a ton of positive effects. It doesn't produce a ton. It produces few economies of scale. Costs generally tend to increase, largely due to a harmonization of service costs and wages. Transitional costs tend to be quite high, and in some cases have even eliminated any immediate cost savings from consolidation. It hasn't really led to any more efficient production or provision of services or delivery, and mergers tend to reduce competition, weakening incentives for responsiveness to local needs, while also reducing the choice of residents to find what we can refer to as an ideal tax services ratio that suits. With that said, it's not all bad news. I'm sometimes asked whether amalgamation is a good thing or a bad thing. And it kind of depends on what you want to do, right? So one of the biggest positives of amalgamation for us in Hamilton is that we can move money around much more easily. So we can take property tax revenue from very wealthy areas, and we can move them around to areas that are experiencing deep and persistent poverty. We can fund things like recreation programs or after school programs or something along those lines. In a way, then we can play a bit of a redistributive role that municipalities and county regional governments have trouble doing. The same trends we've seen in Toronto, where certain areas like East York have benefited tremendously from an upwards service harmonization. And we see the same thing in Hamilton, where you have areas that had lower levels of service have experienced an upwards harmonization over the past 20 years. So in a way, then I think some people could argue that Hamilton is a more equitable city than it was prior to amalgamation. In fact, we've been able to focus economic development efforts more on our downtown core as one city, and avoided some of the precipitous downward spiral that the downtown core experienced from about the 1990s onwards. So the story of Hamilton here, for those who are listening within Waterloo, might be one of a bit of caution, but also a bit of promise, right? That amalgamation has some benefits and it has some drawbacks, right? It's not all bad, it's not all good, but it's something that needs to be carefully considered. What we've seen is that it's very difficult to de-amalgamate, and I think we're going to hear about some of that tonight as well. But it's very difficult to unscramble the egg, so to speak, and move backwards. So I would say that it's very tough to impose a permanent solution because of temporary problems, right? So it's something that I think it's important to think through, and I think that's why it's good that there's forums like this in which we can talk about things and evaluate what the best options for the region might be. And I'm happy to answer any questions as we move forward, but certainly happy to hear what my fellow panelists have to say tonight. So thanks again for having me.
Okay, Zach, thank you very much for that. You brought forward some interesting concepts. One thing you mentioned, and I'll ask you about, I like this concept of the equitable city, which is an interesting term and phrase. But you said Hamilton wasn't the large actor it thought it would be. And I just wonder if you could just explain that a little bit more.
Sure. I think there was this sort of persistent notion around the time of amalgamation that Hamilton would be a big player on the provincial scene, right? That we would have the sway that sort of Toronto would, that we would have much more power and influence when it came to provincial politics being one large massive city. And I think it may have somewhat to do with our kind of persistent inferiority complex, looking at our neighbors down the road in Toronto, right? Argos, Ticat stuff, right? kind of happens. With that said, there were other cities that grew to prominence around us. So like Mississauga, Brampton, that, took kind of our place on the sort of provincial scene a bit, right? So we never really kind of got that kind of ability where we were able to, be able to have a bit more say and power when it came to what the province wanted to do with municipal affairs. And we never really proved to be a really kind of sizable regional actor as well. So I think that some of those kind of hopes and dreams were somewhat dashed in the ensuing years after. But
I'm just wondering then, and maybe we can touch on it after we'll move on to the next speaker, but later on, is amalgamation only one large city, or, two cities, for example, in Waterloo Region, instead of one large city, 2 out of the 7, for example, or some variation of that? We may have maybe a few more options than Hamilton had, given the size of Hamilton proper. And I don't know, with respect to the other municipalities that joined at that time, I don't know if Ancaster or what have you, for example, what sizes we were talking about.
Yeah, there were a few other options. The province really kind of zeroed in on collapsing the region, but there were a few other options. So, for instance, Flamborough put forward a couple of options where they would join with Cambridge, right, and that they would join with Wellington County, right? I think that because they were, for the most part, rural, they didn't really see a natural home with downtown Hamilton, and that's been a somewhat uneasy partnership. We've seen tremendous growth within Flamborough over the last 10 to 15 years, and I think that has maybe balanced things out a bit, especially within the southern part of Flamborough. But there were a number of alternatives put forward, and I think that I don't know how seriously any of these were actually taken, but from a provincial perspective, at that point in time, the focus was on erasing internal boundaries and saying that you have a natural governing unit here with the regional government. I think that this was aided by the fact that the city of Hamilton and the region of Hamilton Wentworth had already consolidated a lot of administrative functions. So there was this sort of natural idea that that we were moving towards consolidation regardless.
Okay, interesting. And just on Flamborough, a little piece of Flamborough ended up with North Dumfries Township over in the Clyde Branchton area. So it's interesting you mentioned that. Okay, thanks, Zach, and we'll watch for some questions later on and bring you back in after.